Welcome all to the first session of Holy of Holies, Readings in Shir Ha-shirim and its reception with Miriam Gedwiser, part of our spring span at Drisha. Shir Ha-shirim can be both confusing and sublime. What is this series of love poems doing in Tanakh? Assuming that it has some non-surface meanings, what is it and how can we access it? In this course, we will read select passages from Song of Songs with midrashic, medieval, and later commentators to get a taste of the possible answers to these questions and more. It is always a pleasure to have Rabbanit Gedwiser teaching here at Drisha. She is a member of the faculty at SAR High School and honestly a longtime teacher at Drisha in our various courses, programs, Beit Midrash, both virtual and in person, and as well as an alumni of including various story institutions. Drisha, always glad to have her here. Sources for this class will be shared in chat once things get underway. And with that, I'm going to hand over the mic.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. It's always a pleasure to be back. I always go through a cycle of teaching for Drisha where I'm like, that sounds like so amazing. And then it always happens in a week where I'm like, oh, and I have 1,000 other things, but I'm always happy. Once I get here, I'm always happy to be here. So thank you. And thank you all for coming, familiar and other faces. So this is a three-part class. Shir Ha-shirim we read on Pesach, so that's the timing. I was like, wow, that's such an interesting description. I want to know the answer to those questions too. We're gonna unpack some of them. I think my plan is just each week to do something kind of a little different and just sort of like a little bit about different ways that people have read Shir Ha-shirim. This week I want to start with a little bit of an introduction and then look at kind of two big picture things, both of which can come, or a few big picture things that can come out of this text. So maybe with that, I will share I will share my version of the source sheet so I could point at it. And if people are familiar, this title of Holy of Holies came from a midrash that we will see later on. But just to note, actually, right, Shir Ha-shirim, the Song of Songs, this is where I'm going to start. What does that even mean? That's how the book describes itself, right? Shir Ha-shirim Asher Li Shlomo. This is the Song of Songs of Solomon, that is to Solomon or of Solomon or by Solomon. Okay. I'm not going to talk so much about like these historical questions, like who wrote it and when and why did it become part of the Bible in that like historical way? Because I feel like I'm certainly not the expert on those things. But yeah. So here, Shir Ha-shirim, one way to think about it is like Kodesh Kodashim, right? Shir Ha-shirim, like Kodesh Kodashim is the most holy place, right? Melech HaMelachim, right? The King of Kings is like the most kingy kind of king. So Shir Ha-shirim maybe it's like the most song kind of song, maybe, right? Or like the supreme kind of song in some way. And you'll have different rabbinic interpretations of sort of how amazing it is or what it is, which will come to some of them. But one thing that really struck me was this from Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah. And we'll encounter different midrashim on Shir Ha-shirim over the course of this course, or even this day. But Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah, right, is part of the Midrash Rabbah universe of midrashim. And here is what Rabbi Shimon says in B'Shem Rabbi Chani in Ditziporin. It's a place. Amar Shir Kaful. Shir Ha-shirim, the Song of Songs, actually it's somehow a double song. And Rabbi Shimon says, Kaful u'mechupal. It's double. This is a nice translation, not mine. Doubled and redoubled, right? So there's something. This is, I guess, where I wanted to open because I think one of the things that we're going to see, well, a few things, right? The book, so-called book itself, is multivocal and not obviously linear, right? It seems like it's a collection of different songs and people divide them up differently. And it's not, there don't seem to be in like I'll stick with this. They're not in an obviously narrative progression. It's not like they start out like this and then they come to this other thing. And in fact, there's a lot of, this is one understanding of this midrash actually from Shir Ha-shirim, that what's double about it, there's a lot of whole phrases that repeat throughout the book, right? Like we'll talk about this probably next time, right? Where the main female character says, Hishpati etchem benot Yerushalayim, I make you swear, daughters of Jerusalem. She does it a bunch of times in what seem to be equivalent ways. There's a bunch of sort of what seems like actual repetition. So it's a little bit hard to see a linear flow of the book, although people try in different ways. Um, and that's sort of one thing that's going on. And then as the rabbis try to interpret this collection, they are finding other layers to it, right? And it's doubled and redoubled. I think before we even see how one might interpret those words, it's getting at something about Shir Ha-shirim, which is that to the extent we're going to get religious meaning out of it, it's going to be multi-layered. There's going to be a lot of things lying on top of each other or otherwise kind of or overlapping or something. It's not going to be straightforward. Um, so here I have one interpretation of this midrash, right, from Reb Shmuel Yaffe Ashkenazi, who was actually apparently Ashkenazi, meaning I don't know if his descendants were right. Usually it's like people with the last name Ashkenazi are usually not Ashkenazi, but he was the head of the Ashkenaz community in Constantinople. So he says what's double about the song, not that the language is double, for example, but that there's two voices or just on the pshat level, right? And the straightforward meaning of the book, there's the female voice and the male voice, which he's going to identify with Israel and God, which is pretty standard rabbinic, right? Right. So that if we think about like what is the book is a series of love songs, mostly between a woman and a man. Maybe she's called the Shulamit. Maybe he's Shlomo or the king. Maybe not. Maybe he's just the Dode and the Raya. People call them, right? The male lover and the female lover. They don't have necessarily a full narrative progression. There's a lot of iteration and reiteration and recapitulation of similar terms. There are some other characters, right? There's some watchmen who are scary, who you have to avoid at night. There's these daughters of Jerusalem who she talks to. Maybe we'll encounter some of those people. And that's kind of like the raw material. And what the rabbis are going to do, and everybody basically later, once it's in the Bible, it has to be something more than just that love poems, right? So we're going to try and find what is it, right? And that's the second thing he says, right? Not just right, doubling of who's speaking, and I'll say one more thing about that in a second, but it's sort of a nice container, right? The beauty it has and the content, right? That like the aesthetic pleasantness of the poems plus whatever they stand for. So that's sort of just how I want to open that. There's a lot of sort of overlap layers and other things. The one more thing I want to say about the voices of the Dode and the Raya, the male and the female lovers, is that, and this will come out by the end of today, a lot of what's happening is that first of all, she speaks more than him a little bit, and they are not together a lot. Right. There's a lot of like looking for each other, talking about each other, trying to find each other. We'll study one sort of like well-known passage where they have like a, misconnection kind of maybe next week. But there's sort of a lot of them talking about each other and around each other and almost trying to find each other. And it's notwithstanding something we'll see in a minute, it's not necessarily, especially because of the nonlinear nature of the book, like a happy ending where like we didn't know each other, then we met, and now we're married happily forever. And that also is suggestive when you're thinking about allegorical or symbolic meanings. Okay, so I've brought here Rashi because we're going to come back. Basically, what I want to do is, first of all, look at some of the ways that people read or talk about Shir Ha-shirim in the abstract, and then come back to some particular texts. So this Rashi is going to serve a few functions. First, we're going to see how Rashi introduces Shir Ha-shirim and what he thinks he's doing there. And then later on, God willing, I will focus on some specific choices that he makes, let's say. And he also begins with this idea of sort of multi-layered or vocality. Sorry. Okay. Achat diber Elokim. God spoke once, shtayim zu shamati. And I heard this twice, sort of a great rabbinic pasuk, meaning it's a pasuk, but it's very fruitful for the rabbis because it means, right, any pasuk, mikra achad yotzei lechama te'amim. I'm in source 3, right? One pasuk can actually go out to multiple meanings. V'sof davar ein lecha mikra yotzei midei pshuto. And, or I would say, but in the end of the day, the verse only has its plain meaning umashmao. Or sorry, it does not that it only has, it never fully leaves. This is Rashi justifying his method where he's going to have to explain to you like what the words mean and what they're doing in addition to whatever they mean underneath. Va'af al pi shedibru hanaviim divreihem bedugma. Even though the prophets use dugma, sort of examples or allegories, tzarich liyashev hadugma al ofaneha. You have to you have to sort of settle the example on its ofaneha, sort of on its base, right? Va'al sidra, and by its order. Kamoshem mikraot sidurim zeh achar zeh. And here Rashi is sort of telling us something that's true about Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah, but it's not set out programmatically. Was that Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah takes, and I would say like the majority of the classical, like the midrashim and the classical sources understand Shir Ha-shirim as a metaphor, sorry, or as an allegory, and specifically as being about the relationship between God and Israel collectively, right? And the references within the book are going to be references to historical events or actions or behaviors or halachot that pertain to the Jewish people as a whole. But what Rashi here is noticing is that, and we'll see this later, right? You could have many, many midrashim on any given pasuk. This pasuk is about Moshe and Aaron. This pasuk is about crossing the Red Sea. This pasuk is about crossing the Jordan. They're not going to appear in any necessarily historical order. They're not going to necessarily relate to what happened in the pasuk before. And Rashi's sort of setting out his idea that he's going to try and take from these midrashim and put them in some kind of an order so that the book tells like a little bit more of an orderly historical allegory. Even that's not going to 100% work for him, but that's sort of, a little bit of a recap of what has happened in the allegorical readings until now, which is people have put a lot of historical stuff in here. It's kind of a big jumble, and Rashi's going to want to organize it. In terms of intro, that's kind of right, and he even says that, right? I'll read in English, I've seen multiple midrashei Agada, right, for this book. Some organize an entire book into one, right? First of all, he's saying their sources. You have Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah, for example. Then you have midrashim about Shir Ha-shirim that appear in the Tanchuma, which we're about to see, or in other places. So he's kind of collecting from multiple sources that are themselves filled with like multiple references to different times, and he's going to try and put it verse by verse in a way that kind of is more misudar, makes a little more like is orderly. And then down at the bottom, he's going to say, right. Vamarti Bili, which is a cute, I think it's a little bit of like a Shlomo reference because that's what Kohelet sometimes says. I said in my heart. So I said I'm going to find the meaning of the verses and I'm going to put them according to their orders, and I will fix each one in its place. Right? Okay. Vomerani. And now he's going to tell you something else that he thinks about the big picture of the book. So I would say until there is very much, there are many different understandings of what the allegory of Shir Ha-shirim, but I would say sort of like the plurality is this, right? It's about God and the Jewish people or the people of Israel and things that happen to them, right? And now he says, V'omerani, Shera'a Shlomo b'Ruach HaKodesh. I say that Shlomo saw in Ruach HaKodesh, Shatidin Yisrael galot gola achar gola, that the Jews would be exiled over and over again. Korban achar korban, destruction after destruction, lidonain begalut zeh, and they would be suffering in this exile. Al kavodam harishon, they would be sort of mourning their initial glory. Lizkor chibar rishona, and they would want to remember the early love, asher hayu segula lo mikol hamim, where they were God's chosen people, basically. And they're going to say, like Hosea predicted, let me go back and return to my first husband. He totally asked, because that was better. These kiruat chasadav, that ma'alam asher ma'alu, and they're going to remember how God treated them and how they rebelled. That hatavot asher amar latet lahem, and everything that God promised them ba'acharit hamim, for the end of days. And that's Shlomo knows that Jewish history is going to be like this cycle of sort of like suffering, exile, betrayal, and desire to return. The Asad HaSefer Hazeh, Beruach HaKodesh, B'lashon Ishat Tzrura Amanut Chayut. And this is Rashi noticing what I said, which is that often the couple is actually not together in the book. That the book, he's saying, is told mostly from the perspective of a woman who is in Amanut Chayut, right? Living widowhood, where she's married, but her husband is absent, right? So she's fully alone, right? She can't marry someone else, for example. And she sort of misses her husband. He's using Shir Ha-shirim language here, right? And she's remembering how great it used to be. She's realizing that she has done something wrong, and it's sort of like a nostalgia book. And the husband is Af Doda, her lover, Tsar Lo B'tzarata. He also suffers when she suffers. Maskir Chastei Nora, and he remembers how wonderful it was at the beginning. and that's about like all the sort of the things about her that made him fall in love, basically. Um, and then, right, Lahodia, ki lo milibo ana v'lo shilucha shiluchin, ki od hi ishto v'hu isha v'hu atila. And he sort of wants to let her know that he will bring her back eventually. Um, so this, I'm going to come back to this perspective of Rashi, but I don't know, does anyone notice anything or have any observation or thoughts or comments about that? Meaning, I would say this, Rashi is placing the book in sort of an intentionally nostalgic perspective of a person who is not now enjoying the delights that the book is trying to describe, right? It's all sort of a memory of what was and what we imagine could be, but it's not written for the people actually experiencing whatever the analog of the bliss that the book describes is. And we'll see later, so a little like in sharper relief, let's say, the ways that Rashi's reading maybe is picking up things that are particular to his time. I'll just say now, I guess a preview, right? Some scholars think that Rashi wrote this near the end of his life. The last 8 years of his life are post the First Crusades, right? He's witnessed sort of this, and so there are other parts of Rashi's commentary that people also think may be influenced by this, right? He's witnessed this sort of like triumphant Christianity, Jews both being murdered and also sort of having no power over their own homeland or their own story. And he's writing for people telling sort of when he talks about this book is written for people who feel like they've been forsaken by God, that really like you should hold out, God will come back. Maybe that's the audience that it's for, that audience of sort of post-Crusades Europe. Um, but we'll see that ideas like what he's going to pick up do exist prior to Rashi. Okay, and I just put here like one taste of the kind of midrash that he's talking about that he's going to put in order, right? Shir Ha-shirim Asher Shlomo, right? Um, sorry. First of all, every time it says Shlomo, it's sorry. I'm going to skip this next paragraph. I just want to say at the end, he quotes this midrash that we will see later about Shir Ha-shirim's Kodesh Kodashim. It's so holy. Shekulo Yirat Shamayim v'kibul ol malchuto, because it's all about fear of heaven and accepting God's yoke. Does anyone recognize those words and what they're generally associated with? Yeah,
Like
Kayla.
Matan Torah?
Okay. Right. Accepts accepting God's covenant, maybe. Kabbalat ol malchut shamayim. Yeah, mother. What is it? I can't hear you, but I think I read your lips, right? That's Kriyat Shema language. That's how the rabbis describe what Kriyat Shema is. You accept the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, right? And it's interesting here that Rashi is using the word fear, right? What is the dominant emotion in Shir Ha-shirim? Arguably love, right? And we know that love and fear are kind of a dichotomy in relation to God. So there's something already there, a little move, which I think we'll come back to in the second half. But here's just an example of the type of allegory. The Reach Shemanecha Tovim, right? The first verse, like the fragrance, let God kiss me, let him kiss me, doesn't say God, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, ki tovim, because his love is greater than wine. L'reach shemanecha tovim, like the fragrance of good oils, your name is like flowing oil, right? That's why the girls love you. That's a loose translation of the first pasuk. So what does it mean, like the fragrance of good oils? Those dwelling at the ends of the earth smelled. What did they smell? They heard your reputation when you performed awesome deeds in Egypt. Your name is like flowing oils. That's why you're called. You're like oil that's being poured forth, right? And who are some of the people who come? Shekain derech shemen arev b'chol. Okay, so like smell nice oil is really smelly. Everybody wants to come smell it. Alkain alamot ahivucha. Therefore, the girls love you. The young maidens love you. Excuse me. Bayitro lekolash moabnit gayer. A few weeks ago, the parsha, right? Because God's miracles that He performed with, the Exodus were so sweet smelling. Yitro smelled them and came, and also Rachav Hazona, who converted, right, who wanted to join the Jewish people. This is sort of that's what I mean by historical allegories. It's about things that happened in the history of the Jewish people, often in Tanakh, right? And this is also just one more thing, right? Who are the alamot, the young maidens? Right, according to the allegories, the young maidens are the other nations, right? So there's sort of this like third party who's kind of especially in Rashi's telling, where really the audience is these people, the Jewish people who are feel abandoned in this imagined universe or this remembered universe. Actually, it was the other people who were jealous of us, kind of thing. Um, okay, so that's sort of, I would say, like the classic type of allegory. There are many other versions of Malbim, I believe, has something about, right, the relationship of the intellect and the soul, or different soul and the body. There are different ways of understanding the allegory, but I would say the big two. One is that a lot of the midrashim are this kind of like events. Shir Ha-shirim is about specific events, and people often like to quote this Rambam as kind of a counterweight to that. So here's what he says in the Laws of Repentance. And here he's right. He's not talking about Yirat Hashem per se. He's talking about Ahavat Hashem, love of God. Ketzad hi ahava haruyah. What is the proper type of love, appropriate love? Hu sheyohav et Hashem ahava gedola yetera azam me'od ad sheteh nafsho kshura ba'avat Hashem. Right? You should love God so very much, very strongly, until his soul is bound up in the love of God. V'nimtza shogeh batamid. He's always sort of like crazy over it. Ki'ilu choleh chol yava, as if he's lovesick. She'ein dato pnuya me'ava taisha. But a person who's lovesick, he never stops thinking about that girl. That woman, excuse me. V'hu shogeh batamid, he's always crazy over her. Ben b'shivto ben kumo, sitting or standing. Ben b'shashu ochel v'shoteh. By the way, that's another possible Shema analogy, b'shivtecha, right? Kind of, right? He's saying whatever position you're in all the time, right? You should always be thinking about God. Actually, your love of God should be greater than that. Belevo havav, the love of God in the heart of God's those who love Him. Shogim batamid, always crazy over it. Kamoshet tzivina b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha, with all your heart and with all your soul. V'hu sheshlomo amar derech mashal, and this is why Shlomo said ki cholat ava ani. Later in Shir Ha-shirim, the Ra'aya, the female lover, says, "I am sick with love." Rambam is saying that's describing the way you should feel about God. V'chol Shir Ha-shirim mashal hu li'inyan zeh. All of Shir Ha-shirim is an analogy for this idea, or a parable. It's not a parable for events in the history of the Jewish people. It's a parable for the emotions of somebody who's lovesick for God. That's a little different, right? It's an individual perspective. And it could be that the specific details, for example, of the poems might not have the same kind of, oh, like I'm going to mention this, I didn't put it on the source sheet, right? The two deer are like Moshe and Aaron. It's not going to have that level of one-to-one correspondence, because what matters is kind of the vibe, the feeling that you get when you read it, the emotions that it evokes. That's sort of trying to help you have those emotions. Okay. And just to sort of like push that forward, right? This is sometimes we like to quote the Rambam. We have sort of the excuse me, we have the you have like the way that a lot of medievals see it, and then you have the Rambam. You're like, oh, well, there's really two sides, but actually no one else agreed with the Rambam. But here, like the Rambam's way, it definitely has an afterlife. It's not only the Rambam, it's many other people, and it has an afterlife, right? For example, there is a custom in Nusach Sfard and Nusach Yidot Mizrach to recite Shir Ha-shirim on Erev Shabbat. What's that about, right? That's about Shir Ha-shirim, right? It's related to Kabbalat Shabbat, is the wedding of God and Israel, right? Shir Ha-shirim is it's about that. It's about the religious experience of individuals who are about to accept Shabbat and trying to connect to God personally, right? So here's a little prayer from the Siddur about that, right? Master of the universe, right? Yirat Fanecha, right? Shebizchut Shir Ha-shirim asher kariti v'lamanti. In the merit of this Song of Songs, which I have read and studied, which, by the way, is Holy of Holies. We'll see that in a second. Bizchut psuka, bizchut tevotav. It's verses, it's words, it's letters, it's vowels, it's cantillation marks. This is already sort of like a very, very detailed level, sort of like the omnisignificance of everything in the Bible, which is sort of has probably like a Kabbalistic aura here, right? Every single detail of Shir Ha-shirim is somehow very holy, right? And it's all actually combinations of God's name, right? And it's deep secrets, right? This should be an hour of mercy for me, that you should listen to me. If we call, you should answer us. Right? And it should be as though we attained all the wonders and awesome secrets that are sealed inside Shir Ha-shirim, right? Shir Ha-shirim is a text about devotional religious experience, right? It's not a text about things that happened in the past. It's a text about trying to access God now. So those are sort of, first of all, two ways of looking at it. And I think there's going to be some overlap between them as we proceed. And here, this I just thought was a little interesting and brings me to my first maybe substantive non-introduction thing. So the sitter says, this Nusach Sfard sitter says, if you don't have time to read all of Shir Ha-shirim, here's what you should read. Read these 4 verses, which you can see have the acrostic Ya'akov, Yud Ayin Kaf Kuf Bet, right? They're not actually in the order that they appear in the book, so that they can, but they kind of are. It's just the middle 2 are switched, right? The first one is Yishakeni Mishiko Pihu, right? Give me the kisses of your mouth, or like that's actually a weird translation because it's Pihu, his mouth. Okay. Right, God should kiss me with God's mouth, or let him kiss me with his mouth. But in this context, it's pretty clear that it's an analogy for God, right? Uri tzafonu voe teman, right? North wind, south wind, come blow on my garden, right? So that the perfume may spread and my beloved will come to his garden, right? Now, right? So that's sort of like it starts with the woman's desire, and then she's sort of inviting the lover. Then she says, "My heart, my beloved, here he comes," right? He's leaping over the mountains, right? She invites him, he arrives, and at the end he says, "I have come to my garden, my own bride," right? So this is like this is a linear story to some degree. And that's sort of it's a way to read Shir Ha-shirim, but the last verse is from chapter 5. There are 8 chapters, right? So it's kind of you can do that by not putting things in order, right? And the story here is, right, her part desires him, she invites him here, the end. And that's I think fits with this type of reading where that's the aspiration, right? The book may not fully be like that because life is not like that, but that's the aspiration of saying this in Erev Shabbat, that this song is about achieving a connection. Okay. I have here a bunch of things about the garden. There's this little piece kind of in the middle, the end of chapter 4, beginning of chapter 5, about the garden, right? Chapter 4 is a long description by the male lover of his bride. It seems like it's sort of it ends with him entering the garden, not so subtle a metaphor. So okay. Or with her sort of inviting him again. The reason I put all these things here is that, right, my God, she's a gan na'ul. At first she starts off, she's a closed up spring, and then she's going to become an open spring, right? And then bati legani achoti kala, I have arrived in my garden in the end. Anyone here is Chabad? This is like a really important pasuk in Chabad, where like the analogy is like very strong. It's based on a midrash in Shir Ha-shirim, which I didn't bring here, right? Basi legani. Rabbi Rayah said this whole thing. Okay, fine. The previous Rebbe of Chabad, meaning the most recently deceased Rabbi Reb Nachman Mendel Schneerson's father-in-law, has this whole idea that like this is the point of Jewish life, basically, is to bring God into the world is God's garden. God had to leave because people sin, and the point is to bring God back, for God to be able to inhabit the garden again. And everything we do is to create what they call dira b'tachtonim, right? That God can dwell in the lower levels of the world. So this sort of image is taken pretty seriously, at least by some, right? And that's sort of one version of the story, right? The end there, even if it's not the literal end of the book, the end point, the purpose of the book is to achieve that, to bring God into the quote unquote garden with us and live together. And I just wanted to, the first direction I wanted to just go is to note that there's potentially like a little bit of a reference to a different garden, which is Gan Eden, which is, right, the people are kicked out of Gan Eden. There are guards, just like there are guards in Shir Ha-shirim, who are going to keep them out, right? Because they sin, they sort of lose their, the humans lose their close connection with God. They lose the harmony that they live in with nature. Yael Ziegler talks about this, Dr. Yael Ziegler, about, she has many points that she tries to show this, that sort of the harmony between humans and animals, man and woman, humans and God that exists in Gan Eden before the sin is resurrected to some degree. Resurrected might not be the right word in Shir Ha-shirim, right? Or over the course of even of Tanakh, right? You don't go back to Gan Eden, but you do go. Eretz Canaan is kind of a substitute for Gan Eden, but that the harmony between man and wife is never actually so like, right? Gan Eden is the place where it's easy to farm, and Shema promises us that if you do what God wants in Eretz Canaan, it will be easy to farm there. I'm not 100% convinced by that part of the analogy, but this I think is kind of interesting, which is that, right, the hierarchy between men and women that's introduced after Chava's sin, or Adam and Chava's sin, is not something that the rest of the Chumash necessarily seems interested in correcting. Um, and this book has seems to be playing off of it, right? So the curse of Chava is here. Aleisha mar harba arbe etzvonech v'heronech, right? I will make your labor pains very great. In pain will you bear children. Ve'el ishech teshukatech, but your desire is for your husband, v'hu yimshol bach, and he will rule over you. A lot of ways to read that, but this seems to be clearly hierarchical, and the point is the woman desires the husband, and either that's the source of his power, or he has power for some other reason, but that makes her vulnerable to his power, right? And that desire is presented as asymmetrical and a source of her weakness, right? And the similar language appears with Cain, where like the sin's desire is towards him. This word teshukah appears 3 times in Tanakh, as far as I know. 2 of them are in Breshit, in these parallel sort of like sin contexts and the woman's punishment for the sin. The third is here in Shir Ha-shirim, Ani lidodi v'alai teshukato. I am to my beloved, and his desire is towards me, which is the reversal, right? As opposed to her desire being towards him and that being a burden or a curse, either the reality or the imagined future of Shir Ha-shirim is one where his desire is towards her, and the hierarchy has been a little bit ameliorated, let's say. So, and I think this is in keeping with sort of everything, this Rambam and Kabbalat Shabbat and everything approach of Shir Ha-shirim. Shir Ha-shirim is sort of it's a, I don't know what's blanking on a word, like a salvo, or sort of like a shot at like a little bit of a utopian way of being, both for individuals, right? Shabbat is like Me'ein Olam Haba, and we want to access something that we usually can't access, and maybe a way of imagining the world without all the sort of burdens and curses or whatever that we've accumulated over time. And that like maybe that's part of why the woman is doing so much of the talking, because she's trying to rectify that, and the man is amenable to that, to a rebalancing here. So that's sort of, I think, I mean, okay. I would say I have like 1 and 2 halves ways now, right? We have the Rashi way where there's allegories to specific historical events. Rashi and a lot of midrashim, which we'll see in a second, right? We have the Rambam way where there's kind of there's an individual religious experience that you're going for. This idea, this is not anybody, meaning this is sort of a modern literary analysis, but it's there. And we'll see that the Midrash is aware, I think, of this Gan Eden parallel. But right, this idea that it might not be only we individually who are trying to restore a connection in a religious experience, but we collectively are trying to restore some idyllic religious way of being. Okay. So that's those are the nice thoughts. I want to go back for a second. Well, this will bring us back. I want to get back into the sort of midrashic state of mind for the next 25 minutes or so. And this will bring us back to the way Rashi frames his, what he says also, which is like this. Midrash Tanchuma Tetzava, again, right? This is what Rashi's saying. The midrashim on this are all over the place. So this is going to start with, talking about Shir Ha-shirim in the abstract. And it's going to say some, I think, pretty interesting things along the way. So here we are. Midrash Tanchuma is a relatively late midrash, but okay. I actually brought this because it's shorter than a version in Shir Ha-shirim, but this is Shir Ha-shirim Rab, which I think is a little earlier. But okay, this is pre-Rashi, pre-Crusades. V'ata tetzaveh, right? This is last week's parsha, 2 weeks ago's parsha, right? And who are you, tetzaveh? You are, Hashem is telling Moshe to command Bnei Aaron to bring olive oil to light the menorah. Okay, somehow this pasuk, this command of Moshe to Aaron regarding the menorah is the meaning of this verse from Shir Ha-shirim, Hinach yafa rayati hinach yafa. Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, you are beautiful, right? Which again, you see again the little repetition of the same phrase, which is one of the meanings of Shir Kaful, right? A doubled song. Okay, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is our Shir Ha-shirim champion. Lo haya kol ha'ulam kulo kedai. And some people may be familiar with a Mishnah in Masechet Yadayim, where there seems to be machloke, where other rabbis seem to think actually Shir Ha-shirim maybe shouldn't be canonized. Rabbi Akiva was like, no, it's amazing. It has to be in the canon. So here he's saying that without the disagreement. Lo haya kol olam kulo kedai ki yom shenitan bo Shir Ha-shirim l'Israel. Right, the day that Shir Ha-shirim was given to Israel is like the most important day ever. Shekol Tuvim Kodesh, all of the writings, meaning all the scriptures, are holy. V'Shir Ha-shirim Kodesh Kodeshim, and the Song of Songs is the Holy of Holies, meaning it's the inner, right? The Holy of Holies is the inner chamber in the Mishkan or in the tabernacle of the Beit HaMikdash or the temple, right? That's the place you want to go, but you want to get, but you can't get there, right? It's a very limited place to get, similar to Gan Eden, actually. Usually you can't get back there. Okay, Marbi Lazar ben Azariah. Mashal Mahdavar Dema. What is an analogy? And it's so this is a question for us. Is he explaining what Rabbi Akiva said or his own thing? But it seems like he's saying, according to him, what makes Shir Ha-shirim so holy? L'melech shenatal sa'al shechitim. A king took a bushel, I don't know if it's really a bushel, an amount of wheat berries here, right? He gave it to baker, and he said to him, get me a certain amount of fine flour out of this. Kach v'kach subin, and some, then there will be some amount of bran, kach v'kach morsan, and some like of the even coarser stuff. Basically, it's going to be kind of like the wheat berries are going to generate different kinds of products. From this whole bushel of wheat, I'm going to get one really good cake from the best, finest flour, right? Kach kolak tuvim kodesh. So that's what it means. All the rest of the scripture are holy, meaning they're like the wheat. The Shir Ha-shirim kodesh kodeshim, and Shir Ha-shirim is like the special cake that's been distilled out of everything else, which is actually like a sort of ironic thing to say, because Shir Ha-shirim is the thing that requires more explication, that doesn't tell you what it's about, right? Shir Ha-shirim never says, P.S. This is an analogy for the love of God in Israel, right? Or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting to make it as Shir Ha-shirim is the thing that is sort of made the most digestible, let's say, if you want to take the cake analogy further, because it's not actually. And I think that, or it's not fully, it's not as necessarily as obvious or accessible, but I think what they're saying is whatever Shir Ha-shirim is supposed to do to you, whatever like Rambam type feelings it's supposed to help you access, those are the thing. Those are the real thing, right? Everything else is trying to get you there. Okay. And now it's going to interpret this phrase, Hinach Yafash. Remember we said, so that's sort of like a background to Shir Ha-shirim. Shir Ha-shirim is so holy, right? It's so special. And this indirect way of talking may actually be the most direct in some way of all. But what does that have to do with Hinach Yafa Rayati? Behold, thou art fair, my beloved. You are beautiful, right? Like, what does that have to do with, why is that the proof text for Shir Ha-shirim being so special? So we're going to have to get through a lot to get there. But I think that we should do it in order. Actually, no, I think we should do it not in order. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, right? So I'm going to skip. No, I changed my mind yet again. I'm just gonna look. We're not going to read all of it, but this gives you a sense of when Rashi's describing sort of like the chaos he experiences of trying to put the midrashim together. This is kind of what he's describing. Like I said, this is a shorter version compared to Shir Ha-shirim Rabbah, right? Where Hinach Yafa b'ma'asecha. What does it mean? You are, right? Hinach Yafa is doubled. So what does that mean? You are beautiful in your deeds. You're beautiful in the deeds of your fathers. You're beautiful in the house. You're beautiful in the field. You're beautiful in the house with the mezuzah, right? And in the field because you take the agricultural tithes, right? This is again like Bnei Israel do mitzvot, and that is what God loves about them, right? And there's so many different sort of like, this and that interpretations that you could have, right? You are beautiful in the house and on the roof, right? When you build a new house, you have to put a barrier on the roof. So you do that, right? In this world and in the next world, there's so many different pairs that we could have, right? Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi says, why is God praising her in double language? Right. Well, not actually. Right. God praises her in double language, but she praises him in single language because God has the choice to take someone else and doesn't, and she doesn't have the choice. Could work out exactly how that works. It's not 100% clear to me, but Right. So this is a sense of sort of like the stream of consciousness meandering. Like we have these two words, hinach yafa hinach yafa ra'iti, hinach yafa einayich yonim, right? You are beautiful. So there's a few things that are fruitful for midrash there. There's a repetition of the same phrase. That's great. We can have all these doubles. What's going on with the doves? We haven't quite figured out yet, right? So that's where we're gonna go. Be'einayich yonim, right? Your eyes are doves. Elu Sanhedrin. Again, right, these are like discrete things about Jewish history and the Jewish people. This is the Sanhedrin who are like a dove. So your eyes, meaning the sort of the people who see for you, your leaders, are like a dove. Just as the eyes sort of lead the body, so the Sanhedrin leads Israel and everybody follows them, right? And they tell them what's tameh and what's pure and impure and great. Okay. Devar acher, right? Just like every dove knows its own home, so, and its own, right? Mayonazo, kol echad v'echad makeret chalomna v'shovchat. It knows its own little home, the dovecote. Kach Yisrael, kol echad v'echad mehen min talmidim makiret mekomo. Right, not just the Sanhedrin, but all of the students. It's very orderly, like the Mishnah elsewhere describes. They all sit in an order from greatest to least, scholar. So that everything is sort of arrayed very neatly like doves. Okay, I don't know so much about doves to know whether that is like neat is a thing that you think of when you think of doves, but okay. Now we're going to have something that maybe we do know about doves, that they mate for life. So too, the Jews are going to mate with God for life once they discover him. And this I underlined, but maybe we'll come back to it. Well, I'll say it. I'm going to come back to it. This is the source for a Rashi that we're going to have later. And now we're going to come back, right? How did we start? This pasuk, Einayich Yonim, is the proof that Shir Ha-shirim is Kodesh Kodashim. It's like getting the special cake out of the big bushel of flour. What does this pasuk have to do with that? Here's what Rabbi Yitzchak is going to say. Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God said to them, Dugma shelcha doma liyona. Your nature is like that of a dove. Mi shemivakesh lukach chitim mechavero. Who omer lo harein dugmatam. When you want to, and now it's explaining what does it mean your nature. So when you want to buy wheat, you ask for a description, grade A, grade B, something like that, right? Afatad dugma shelcha doma liyona. You are like doves, right? You're a grade dove. Ketzad, what does that mean? Which dove in particular? If everybody's our first dove of the Tanakh. Kishaya Noach bateva. When Noach was in the ark, Ma'aktiv sham ve'shalachata orei ve'yetze. Right. So first he sent out the raven and it just flew back and forth. Okay. There's a lot of midrashim about how the raven is so bad there. Okay. And then he sent the dove, the tavo elav hayona, and the dove came to him with what? An olive branch. Remember what our parsha is about, by the way. It's about bringing olive oil. Okay. So the dove came to him with an olive branch. Right? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Maha Yonah Haviyah Oral Olam. Just as the dove brought light to the world, Avatam Shnim Shaltem Kuna, just like you who are like the dove are gonna bring olive oil and light it before me to bring light in the menorah. Right. So this pasuk here, and it's going to be a little bit fleshed out in the next source. I think this is a little bit abridged, which sometimes happens actually with later midrashim. They kind of assume you know things and they don't put in everything you actually need to unpack them, right? But when we said Shir Ha-shirim is Kodesh Kodashim, right? Because that's why the Torah says, right? Well, first of all, what does this have to do with Atat Tzaveh? You, Bnei Israel, are like doves, like the dove who brought the olive branch, right? And brings light to the world, which is interesting, right? There it's metaphorical light. She showed them that their, confinement in the ark is soon going to be over and they're going to have, they're going to be able to leave and have a new life. So too, Bnei Israel are going to bring olive oil to light the menorah. That's the analogy. And I think the idea also is, right, what does this have? This shows how deep Shir Ha-shirim is, right? That Shir Ha-shirim is getting at these fundamental ideas about who we are. That's it. And I want to show sort of like a backstory of this dove analogy, which is here. Einayich yonim, right? This, like I said, Shir Ha-shirim has a sort of a parallel to this whole thing. It also has a bunch of what's the double beauty, this world, the next world, in the home, in the field, all that kind of stuff. Einayich yonim, what does it mean to say your eyes are like doves? Dugma didach damya lahadiona, right? Again, this is the same kind of language. This is obviously like a parallel text to our text, right? Your characteristic is like that of a dove. Ma yonazo huvia oralolam kach Yisrael mevin oralolam. Just as the dove brought light to the world, so Israel brings light to the world, as it says, v'hachu goyim l'orech, right? The nations will walk by your light. The imataya, but so okay, that's very nice. But when did the dove, in fact, bring light to the world? Bimei Noach, right? In the days of Noach, when it says the dove came to him in the evening. She came in the evening is an interesting thing, and she had the olive leaf, right? Mahu taraf befiha katil. So this is like a little bit of an aside. By the way, when it says it was torn off, it's kind of like a violent word. That's the word we hear when Yosef is torn up by a wild animal, allegedly, right? Taraf befiha, it's torn off. The Midrash says it's dead. Kema detemer taruf taraf Yosef, right? That's the analogy. Amar Rabbarachi ilulei ketaltine ilan rav havami David. She actually plucked a branch that would otherwise have grown into a very big tree, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? She's sort of like prematurely kills this tree essentially in order to bring a message to Noach. Where did she get this branch? Which is a good question if there's just been a huge flood. Okay, Rabbi Levi Amar Misham Tute Eretz Yisrael Hiviato. There's this idea that the flood didn't actually rain down on Eretz Yisrael, so maybe the plants there were a little bit less damaged. I don't know. So maybe she was able to take it out of the land of Israel from the branches there. Hadahi Damin. Okay. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. That doesn't work because even even these tools made of stone were destroyed by the water. Even if the water wasn't literally raining on Eretz Yisrael, it's still going to be like stuff is going to be washed away in these torrential sort of flooding, right? Literally from the side. Amar le Rabbi Ivu, right? Rather, right? Rabbi Tarye Amar, Sha'arei Gan Eden Niftechula. Actually, the gates of Gan Eden opened for her, and we Sham Havioto. And from there is where she got this branch, which is kind of funny because that a little bit limits its persuasive value or its probative value in terms of what's going on out there in the world, which is what we think when we read the Torah that it's about. Oh, there's plants in the world. But he's saying actually, right, she's bringing a message from Gan Eden, right? Amarli Rabbi Ivu, Ilami Gan Eden Havioto. Right, so one sec. First of all, I just want to say, right, when it says that then she brought light to the world, it's really kind of leaning in on the analogy there, or sort of the metaphorical sense, which is not like she's bringing maybe a physical sign of life, but she's bringing a symbol of the possible for rebirth and regaining your prior stature, right? The possibility of reaccessing, which is sort of the Shir Ha-shirim idea. Maybe you can reaccess and rebalance what was lost in the sin in Gan Eden. Right. So the dove kind of accesses Gan Eden, right? When in Shir Ha-shirim, when the lover says the female who is Bnei Israel is like a dove, it's like she kind of has accessed Gan Eden in some way. So it's a few layers, but maybe that's going on here. And one more thing. I'm going to say again.
I have a question.
Please.
But here it was not between Hashem and Bnei Israel. It was between Hashem and the world.
Correct. Right. And so what did it say at the top actually? It says Kach Yisrael mevin ora la'olam, right? There's a vision of the Jewish people, at least in this midrash, that they're supposed to be the light unto the nations, right? That just as the dove is, right? The dove is sort of the messenger for the world. Maybe the Jewish people are the messenger for the world.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for noticing that. Okay. So Rabbi Iva says, if she's getting into Gan Eden, shouldn't she have brought something like really cool? Right? There's all sorts of fancy stuff in Gan Eden. What's she doing bringing in olive? Which actually olives are not so delicious when they're raw. Right? They're considering it bitter, right? Kigon kinamon, uvalsama, right? There's like cinnamon, some of these cool tree bark things, nice spices, like there's fancy stuff there. Why is she not bringing that? Ella remez ramzal Noach be'amralo. She taught Noach the following lesson. Mare Noach, master Noach, right? Mar mizeh mitachat yado shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'lo matok mitachat yadcha, right? I would rather have something bitter from God's garden than something sweet from you, right? That what's important is that it comes from Gan Eden, not that it's necessarily enjoyable or pleasurable, which I think is that's going to lead me in a different direction than Shir Ha-shirim, right? There's one vision of Shir Ha-shirim where it's sort of like utopian, like sort of bliss and sort of like people are aspiring to some spiritual experience or something like that, or the Jewish people are aspiring to return to Gan Eden or some various permutations there. There's a side of it that's also the closeness is not all roses and unicorns, as we say. Even though there are a lot of roses or lilies or whatever they are in Shir Ha-shirim. And that is where I'm going to take us for the last 10 minutes. I'm sorry if I'm going to end on a downer, but maybe not 100% downer, medium downer. Okay. So here's Rashi. Like I said before, right? One can Rashi in several places seems after his framing of right the book of Kohelet is a book written for the Jews as future widows essentially, right in the time of Shlomo everything is great, but Shlomo knows that it's not going to be great and he's like preserving that nostalgia for them for later. Rashi makes several choices of midrashim that he chooses that again seem to sort of like emphasize that side of things, that sort of abandonment or suffering side of things. So, for example, on this pasuk, your eyes are like doves. Not this pasuk, a different pasuk where they're referred to as doves, right? Gonai chumaritayach v'dugmatech kayona. That word dugma is from our midrash, right? Your hues, appearance, and characteristics are like those of a dove, right? Hadveka b'benzuga, that we saw, that attaches to its mate, right? When we saw that there's like probably 5 or 10 possible things that Rashi could choose to put here. And he chooses 2. He chooses 1, that they're attached to their mate, and 2, kishesh, this is the part that I skipped above, kisheshoctinota. It's not that Rashi didn't make up this reading, but he picked it out of many possibilities, right? Kisheshoctinota, when they slaughter her, enamefar chesed, she doesn't kind of like struggle or spasm, ela posheta tzavara, she just um, stretches out her neck. So you have given your shoulder to bear my yoke and my fear. You could say that's not about persecution per se. It's just about sort of the difficulties that can come with the covenant. But if you look down here, right here, he's very clear, right? When the other girls, the other maidens, ask the Raya, the female lover, what's so special about your beloved? Rashi says what they're asking is, why do you allow yourselves to be burned and hanged because of him? Right? So it feels like Rashi is definitely writing for an audience that not definitely. It certainly seems plausible that Rashi is writing for an audience that is experiencing persecution. And his way, right, the love story is kind of like a Romeo and Juliet love story where like sad things happen to the people because they're in love. And that's here's a Midrash Lechach Tov, which is a little bit later from Mines, also post-Crusades, right? Talking about being constrained, enduring suffering, right? This is a whole sort of this is a genre that comes up in Shir Ha-shirim, which I think was a little unexpected to me. That's why it's here. Because I was like, it's not what I was thinking of seeing, and it kind of surprised me as I was preparing, and I was like, oh, I guess that's I guess I apologize for putting this in the first class. A little downer, but okay. But I think it's kind of interesting because it's getting at something about, right, if Shir Ha-shirim is just about this magical imagined universe where like everything is fine and we can kind of escape there, how much is it about the lived experience of normal Jews, right? And trying to inserting these kind of darker elements into Shir Ha-shirim is a way of also making it about some of the more intense religious moments of people's lives, right? At least in some times, right? And I think with that, it's actually, we can remember who our person who said that Shir Ha-shirim is Holy of Holies, right? It has this amazing message about the connection of God and Israel, is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says something famous about loving God, which is as follows. This is near the end of Masechet Brachot, maybe familiar to many people. What does it mean? V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, you shall love God. Rabbi Lezer says, okay, so Rabbi Lezer has a thing, right, with all your soul, with all your might, depends if somebody cares more about their money or their property. Okay. Rabbi Akiva has a meaning, an interpretation of this pasuk that says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, here starting at the bottom of page 8. B'chol nafshecha, you should love God with all your soul, afilu notel nafshecha, even if he takes your soul, or maybe even if loving God takes your soul. I mean, even if that commitment is going to lead to your death. And then we have this story of Rabbi Akiva's death, in which I do not really have time to do it justice, so maybe I'm going to summarize it. I encourage you to look at it or learn it on your own. But basically, Rabbi Akiva is teaching Torah in a time when he's not allowed to teach Torah. And this guy, Papos, who's like the foil, Papos ben Yehuda, he's like the Rabbi Akiva foil. We don't really know who he is. He's here to be a Jew who opposes Rabbi Akiva. He's sort of like the accommodationist Jew. He says, Rabbi Yehuda, like, what are you doing? You're going to get killed. And Rabbi Akiva says, let me tell you a story. Here's a parable. So foxes are very common in parables in general in the ancient world. So here too, right? What is it like a fox walking along the riverbank? When he sees fish gathering and fleeing from place to place, like in schools, the fox says, what are you running away from? And they say, well, there's people with nets who might try to catch us. He says, so maybe you should come up onto the land. This is a little bit funny. We'll reside together just like our ancestors did. Leave that aside. I don't know. It's not saying like evolutionarily the fox and the fish have this common ancestor. I don't think. I think that's where the analogy kind of falls apart. Okay. The fish said, you're the one. They say you're smart. Basically, foxes are supposed to be smart. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard, because if I come onto land, I'm just going to die, right? If it's dangerous from here, it's going to be even more dangerous for me up there. And the analogy is, who's the fox? Papos, right? Papos is the fox who's telling me I should give up the Torah. The Torah is like the water that we swim in. If we give it up, we might as well be dead. It's even worse than whatever risk the Romans posed us. So then Rabbi Akiva and Papos both get arrested, and Papos gets arrested for something dumb, which is like an interesting thing about sort of, arbitrary authoritarian regimes, that like you can't actually keep yourself safe by making what you think are safe choices. Right. So like Rabbi Akiva is making a values-based choice to stick with what he thinks is right. Papos is like, no, like that's not safe, but what I'm doing is safe. It turns out what Papos is doing is not safe either. Right. And he says, I wish I were here for a principal reason like you, which, okay. In the end, we have 2 more minutes left. Rabbi Akiva is being executed, right, in a sort of gruesome way. He's being tortured to death, basically. And it's at the time of Shema. And it says, right, they're combing his flesh with iron combs, which we saw at the beginning, right? Rashi said that Shir Ha-shirim is all about Kabbalat, Ol Malchut Shemaim. So he was doing that. He was accepting the yoke of heaven, which means a few things. First of all, it means he's saying Shema, but it also means he has some disposition about accepting the suffering that he's experiencing, right? And his students said to him, Rabbeinu Ad Kan, right? Really? Even now? That's kind of, as my students would say, extra. Amar Lahen, my whole life, Hayiti Mista'era Pasuk, I was always wondering, when the Pasuk says, B'chol nafshecha, which he above interpreted to mean, even if God takes your life, I always wondered, Mataya Voli Adivi Kamenu, when will it come to me and I will be able to uphold it? Meaning, will I have a chance to do that mitzvah? Or when will I have a chance to do that mitzvah? It's possible that mitzvah applies to even a natural death. We can leave that aside, right? Hayam arich be'echad. He was extending the word echad, which is actually elsewhere a halacha about how you're supposed to say Shema. You extend the word echad, and the dalet is it's pronounced differently. Okay, so he was extending the word echad. Echad. His soul left his body as he was saying the word echad, and then Abba calls him and says, "This is amazing, right? This is a sign that you're destined for the world to come." And then the angels are not happy, and Rabbi Akiva is the site for a lot of theodicy in the rabbis of sort of like, Rabbi Akiva was so amazing and he died this terrible way, and how is that fair? The answer, there's no answer as to how that's fair here, but it raises the question, because that is sort of a big question. But why do I have this here? Right. I think that, I don't know if this is right or not, but there's something, I guess what I tried to show tonight is the following, right? There's multiple ways of thinking about Shir Ha-shirim. You could think about it as an allegory about historical events. You can think about it as a metaphor or an allegory about individual or collective religious experience, which is a little bit different. And when you start to think about it in terms of historical context, unexpectedly, or maybe not, Jews experiencing persecution can also reflect that onto this text that's about love, connection, and pleasure, right? Or bliss. And that there's a way of talking about the love between God and Israel that is somehow accounting for that. right? That Rabbi Akiva, who's the person who extols Shir Ha-shirim, is the person whose love of God eventually takes this form of martyrdom, but of some religious experience that kind of transcends it. Some of the Hasidic masters talk about this, right? What does it mean, Yatzah Nishmato Be'echad, right? That's his internal disposition. He is sort of like giving his soul to God, and when he's ready, it goes. And it has nothing to do with what's going on outside of him. Obviously, I don't think that's like physically true, but there's some sense that maybe like the deep level of devotion or connection that Shir Ha-shirim is talking about maybe happens in a nostalgic or imagined or sort of futuristic utopian way in this beautiful garden way. And sometimes it happens in the real life in much darker ways. But that there's something about the metaphor that maybe still gave people strength in those darker situations. That's the thought. It's 9:01. I'll just say briefly, God willing, if you come, I hope to see you next week. And if you come back, we're gonna do something totally different. So hopefully, we'll talk about one of the more narrative sections of Shir Ha-shirim and different ways of reading it. Thank you for being here, and I'm happy to stick around a little bit for questions, and I'll stop
Yep.
or not.
I'm happy to, if people still have questions, I'm happy to keep things open a little bit. Thank you everyone for joining and for making time for learning. I do want to highlight one upcoming class this next Sunday, our annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture with Dr. Shana Strach-Schick on the topic of living the Seder, the role of, quote, intention in observing the Seder mitzvot with and this will be at 12 p.m. on Sunday Eastern. You're welcome to sign up at drisha.org/classes.